Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me today. What you are about to hear is not just a story about clothes or makeup or outward appearances. This is a journey that began in the quiet corners of my heart when I was barely old enough to understand what I was feeling. My name is Alexandra, though for most of my life, people knew me only as Alex. Before we dive into this tale, I want you to know that everything I share comes from a place of authenticity and vulnerability. This account contains moments of joy, pain, confusion, and ultimately liberation. If you have ever felt like you were living a life that did not quite fit, or if you have ever wondered what it means to truly be yourself, then perhaps this narrative will resonate with you in ways you never expected. I grew up in a small town in New England during the early 1960s, a time when conformity was not just encouraged, but essentially demanded. My family lived in a modest two-story house with white shutters and a red door. My father worked at the local manufacturing plant, and my mother stayed home to care for me and my four sisters. Yes, you heard that correctly. I was the only boy in a household dominated by feminine energy, laughter, hairbrushes, and an endless parade of dresses hanging in closets that seemed to call out to me even when I tried to ignore them. My oldest sister, Margaret, was 7 years my senior and carried herself with the poise of someone who already understood the world. Then came Elizabeth, who was 5 years older than me and had a wild streak that my parents constantly tried to tame. Catherine was 3 years ahead, quiet and bookish, always lost in novels with tattered covers. Finally, there was Sarah, just 18 months older than me and my closest companion during those early years. Sarah had a way of looking at me that made me feel like she could see right through whatever facade I was trying to maintain. It was both comforting and terrifying. The earliest memory I have of feeling different, of sensing that something inside me did not align with what everyone expected, happened on a warm afternoon in late spring. I must have been around 5 years old. My sisters were playing dress-up in the living room, twirling around in mother's old scarves and costume jewelry. I watched from the doorway, fascinated by the way the fabric moved, how the light caught the fake gemstones, the transformation that seemed to occur when they draped themselves in these materials. Margaret noticed me standing there and, with a mischievous grin, called me over. She wrapped a long pink scarf around my shoulders and placed a plastic tiara on my head. My sisters erupted in giggles, but I felt something else entirely. I felt a spark of recognition, as if some hidden part of me had suddenly been acknowledged. That moment lasted only a few minutes before my father came home from work. The laughter died instantly. He stood in the doorway, lunch pail in hand, staring at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was not anger exactly, but something colder. Disappointment mixed with confusion. He did not yell. He simply told me to take those things off and go outside to play. I obeyed, but the feeling that had awakened in me during those brief minutes did not disappear. It went underground, becoming a secret companion that followed me through childhood. Growing up surrounded by sisters meant I was constantly exposed to a world that boys were typically excluded from. I watched them get ready for school dances, observed the rituals of hair curling and nail painting, listened to their conversations about which dresses made them feel confident and which ones made them feel invisible. I absorbed all of this information like a sponge, storing it away in some mental archive that I did not yet understand I was building. My sisters never made me feel unwelcome in their spaces. In fact, they often included me in their activities, teaching me how to braid hair or letting me pick out which earrings looked best with which outfits. They treated it as harmless fun, and perhaps for them it was. For me, it was something much more profound, though I lacked the vocabulary to express what I was experiencing. School was a different environment altogether. The boys in my class played rough, talked about sports, and engaged in constant competitions to prove their toughness. I participated in these activities because that was what was expected, but I always felt like an actor playing a role rather than someone living authentically. I was good at baseball, decent at football, and could hold my own in the schoolyard hierarchies that boys establish. But when I came home and heard my sisters laughing upstairs, discussing the latest fashion magazines or planning their outfits for the upcoming week, I felt a pull toward their world that I could not explain and certainly could not act upon. When I turned 9, something happened that would shape the trajectory of my secret desires for years to come. Our town held an annual Halloween celebration, and that year, the theme was characters from history and legend. My sisters spent weeks planning their costumes. Margaret would be Cleopatra, Elizabeth chose Joan of Arc, Catherine decided on Jane Austen, and Sarah wanted to be a pioneer woman. I agonized over what to wear, running through the expected options in my mind. A cowboy, a knight, a pirate, all perfectly acceptable choices for a boy my age. But there was something else tugging at my imagination. One evening, while helping Sarah sort through fabric in the attic, I discovered an old trunk that belonged to my grandmother. Inside were clothes from what seemed like another era entirely. Victorian blouses with delicate lace, long skirts with intricate stitching, gloves that buttoned at the wrist, and a hat adorned with artificial flowers that had faded but still retained a ghostly beauty. Sarah saw the way I was looking at these items, and without a word, she pulled out a complete outfit and held it up against me. The skirt reached my ankles, and the blouse had pearl buttons running down the front. She smiled, not mockingly, but with genuine curiosity. She asked me if I wanted to try it on just to see how it looked. My heart hammered in my chest. This was dangerous territory. But the attic was private, just the two of us, and the temptation was overwhelming. I agreed, though my hands shook as I changed behind an old wardrobe. The sensation of the fabric against my skin was unlike anything I had experienced. The skirt swished when I moved, and the blouse felt simultaneously confining and freeing. Sarah helped me button it properly, then stood back to assess the result. She told me I looked like a character from one of Catherine's novels, and there was no judgment in her voice, only fascination. We spent the next hour in that attic, with Sarah styling my hair using pins she found in the trunk, and even applying a bit of rouge to my cheeks from an ancient compact that had somehow survived decades in storage. When I finally looked at myself in the cracked mirror leaning against the wall, I saw someone who felt more real than the boy who had climbed those attic stairs an hour before. We never spoke of that afternoon again, at least not directly. But something unspoken passed between Sarah and me, a shared secret that created a bond neither of us fully understood. When Halloween arrived, I dressed as a cowboy, complete with a plastic gun and a hat my father bought at the general store. I collected candy, played games, and acted exactly as expected. But in the privacy of my own mind, I was wearing that Victorian outfit, feeling the weight of the skirt, the delicate texture of the lace, the transformation that came not from the clothes themselves, but from the permission they gave me to imagine a different version of myself. As I moved into my teenage years, the feelings I had been harboring grew more complex and more difficult to ignore. Puberty brought with it a cascade of changes that seemed to emphasize everything I felt disconnected from. My voice deepened, my shoulders broadened, facial hair began to appear. Each physical change felt like a step away from something I could not name, but desperately wanted to preserve. My sisters were navigating their own transformations, dealing with boyfriends, school dances, and the social pressures that came with adolescence. I watched from the sidelines, envious of the freedom they seemed to have to explore their identities, to experiment with fashion and presentation in ways that were encouraged rather than forbidden. When I was 14, my family underwent a significant change. My father received a promotion that required us to move to a larger house on the outskirts of town. The new place was beautiful, a 3-story Victorian home with a wraparound porch and a tower room that my parents turned into storage. That third floor became my bedroom, a decision that gave me more privacy than I had ever known but also more temptation. The storage area adjacent to my room was filled with old furniture, boxes of books, and most significantly, trunks containing my mother's clothes from the 1940s and 50s. These were not the Victorian garments from my grandmother's trunk. These were more recent, items my mother had worn during her own youth. There were swing dresses with full skirts, pencil skirts that hugged the hips, blouses with Peter Pan collars, and undergarments that belonged to an era when foundation garments were considered essential. There were girdles with garter clips, long-line bras with dozens of hooks, slips made of silk that had yellowed slightly with age, and stockings still in their original packaging. The discovery of these items felt like stumbling upon a treasure trove of possibility. At first, I simply looked at the clothes, running my fingers over the fabric, imagining what it would be like to wear them. But curiosity is a powerful force, especially when combined with years of suppressed desire. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, I carefully extracted a complete outfit from one of the trunks. I chose a navy blue dress with white polka dots, a style I had seen in old photographs of my mother. The accompanying undergarments were complex, involving far more steps than the simple boxers and t-shirts I was accustomed to. I struggled with the girdle, confused by the garter clips and the way the entire contraption was supposed to fit. The long-line bra was similarly challenging, with its rows of hooks and its structure that seemed designed for a body very different from mine. But I persisted, driven by a need that felt almost primal. When I finally had everything on and slipped the dress over my head, zipping it up as far as I could reach, something inside me shifted. I looked at myself in the mirror, and despite the obvious masculine features I could not hide, despite the awkward fit and the amateur nature of the entire endeavor, I felt a sense of rightness that I had been chasing since that afternoon in the attic with Sarah. I felt feminine in a way that had nothing to do with external validation and everything to do with internal recognition. I spent hours that night simply existing in that space, moving carefully around my room, feeling the restriction of the girdle, the support of the bra, the way the dress moved with my body. It was not sexual, though I know that is what many people assume when they hear stories like mine. It was about identity, about accessing a part of myself that I had been taught to suppress but could no longer ignore. This became my ritual. Once or twice a week, late at night after the house had settled into sleep, I would dress in my mother's vintage clothes. I learned through trial and error how to properly wear the foundation garments, how to create a more feminine silhouette, how to move in ways that felt natural rather than forced. I experimented with different styles, different eras, different expressions of femininity. Sometimes I felt elegant and sophisticated. Other times I felt playful and youthful. The clothes became a language through which I could communicate with a hidden part of myself, having conversations that were impossible in the light of day. But this secret life came with a constant undercurrent of fear. I was terrified that someone would discover what I was doing, that my father would come upstairs unexpectedly, that one of my sisters would need something from storage and find me dressed in clothes that would be impossible to explain away. I developed elaborate systems to ensure I would not be caught. I memorized the exact position of every item I borrowed, so I could return it precisely as I found it. I kept my ears attuned to any sound in the house, ready to change at the first creak of a floorboard. I never took risks during times when discovery was even remotely possible. This vigilance was exhausting, but the alternative, giving up these moments of authentic expression, felt impossible. High school brought new challenges. I was expected to date girls, to participate in the masculine rituals of teenage life, to solidify my identity as a young man preparing to enter the adult world. I had girlfriends, relationships that were genuine in many ways but always incomplete because I was hiding such a fundamental part of who I was. I went to prom, played on the baseball team, attended parties where boys boasted about their conquests and their plans for the future. I played the part convincingly enough that no one suspected the double life I was leading. But the dissonance between my public and private selves grew wider with each passing year. My sisters began leaving home one by one. Margaret got married the summer after I turned 16. Elizabeth left for college in California. Catherine received a scholarship to study literature at a prestigious university on the East Coast. Only Sarah remained, and she would be gone within another year. With each departure, I felt a strange mixture of loss and relief. I would miss them terribly, but their absence also meant fewer people to potentially discover my secret. Sarah's departure was the hardest. We had always been close, and though we had never spoken about that afternoon in the attic when I was 9, I felt that she carried some understanding of me that others lacked. The day she left for nursing school, she hugged me tightly and whispered something in my ear that I have never forgotten. She told me that whoever I became, whatever path I chose, she would always love me. At the time, I thought it was just a sweet goodbye. Years later, I realized she had always known. College offered the promise of freedom, of escape from the small town where everyone knew everyone and privacy was nearly impossible. I enrolled in a state university about 3 hours from home, far enough to establish independence, but close enough that my parents expected regular visits. I chose a school with a large student body where I could be anonymous, where I could potentially explore aspects of myself that had been locked away for so long. But when I arrived on campus, I found that freedom was more complicated than I had imagined. I was assigned to a dormitory with a roommate, a situation that made any private exploration impossible. The bathroom was communal, shared by an entire floor of young men who treated it as a locker room rather than a private space. There were no locked doors, no moments of guaranteed solitude, no trunks of vintage clothing waiting to be discovered. I threw myself into my studies, pursuing a degree in business administration because it seemed practical and safe. I joined clubs, made friends, and continued to date women in relationships that always felt like I was performing rather than participating fully. I became skilled at compartmentalization, at pushing down the desires that had once found expression in my nighttime rituals at home. I told myself that perhaps this was just a phase, something I would outgrow now that I was becoming a man in the eyes of society. I tried to convince myself that those feelings belonged to adolescence, that adulthood meant leaving behind childish fantasies and embracing reality. But suppression does not equal elimination. The feelings did not go away. They went deeper, becoming a dull ache rather than an active presence. I graduated from college, took a job at an accounting firm in a mid-sized city, and attempted to build the life that was expected of me. I was 23 years old, living in my own apartment for the first time, earning a steady paycheck, and dating a woman named Patricia who worked in the same building. Patricia was kind and intelligent, with dark hair that she wore in a practical bob and a laugh that made everyone around her smile. We fell into a relationship that progressed along the expected timeline. We dated for 6 months, became exclusive, met each other's families, and began discussing the future. The apartment I rented was a 1-bedroom unit on the 4th floor of an older building. It had high ceilings, hardwood floors, and most importantly, complete privacy. For the first time since leaving my childhood home, I had a space that was entirely my own, with a door that locked and no one to answer to regarding how I spent my time. The temptation to revisit the practices I had abandoned during college became overwhelming. But I no longer had access to my mother's vintage clothing. Those trunks remained in the storage area of my parents' home, and I could not exactly show up and ask to borrow them. Instead, I began to make small purchases. Nothing too obvious, nothing that would raise questions if someone happened to see a receipt. I started with basics. A pair of panties from a department store, purchased during a lunch break and paid for with cash at a self-checkout. I told myself it was just curiosity, just a one-time thing to satisfy the lingering questions from my youth. But one purchase led to another. A bra, chosen carefully based on approximate sizing, also bought with cash in a store far from my neighborhood. A slip, a pair of stockings, each acquisition feeling both thrilling and shameful. I kept these items hidden in the back of my closet, behind boxes of financial documents and winter clothes, retrieving them only late at night when I was certain I would not be disturbed. The sensation of wearing these items again after years of abstinence was overwhelming. It was like returning home after a long exile, like speaking a language I had been forbidden to use, like accessing a part of myself that I had nearly convinced myself was imaginary. I would dress completely, even though I had nowhere to go and no intention of being seen. I would simply exist in that state, moving around my apartment, doing mundane tasks like washing dishes or reading a book, feeling a sense of peace that eluded me during my regular daily life. These moments became sacred, a form of meditation that allowed me to access emotional depths I could not reach any other way. But maintaining this double life while in a relationship with Patricia became increasingly difficult. She began spending more time at my apartment, sometimes arriving unexpectedly after work, occasionally staying overnight on weekends. I had to be constantly vigilant about my hidden wardrobe, ensuring that nothing was ever out of place, that no evidence existed of my secret activities. The stress of this vigilance took a toll. I became anxious, checking and double-checking that all my feminine items were properly concealed, living in constant fear of accidental discovery. Patricia noticed the change in my behavior. She asked if I was okay, if there was something bothering me, if she had done something wrong. I reassured her that everything was fine, that I was just stressed about work, that I needed to adjust to the demands of adult life. She accepted these explanations, but I could see doubt creeping into her eyes. Our relationship progressed despite my internal turmoil. Patricia's parents expected us to get married, and my own parents had begun making comments about grandchildren and the importance of settling down. The pressure was immense, and I felt trapped between the life I was living and the life I desperately wanted to explore. When Patricia proposed, yes, she proposed to me during a weekend trip to the coast. I said yes because saying no would have required explanations I could not provide. We set a date for the following spring, began planning the kind of wedding that made both sets of parents happy, and I tried to convince myself that marriage would somehow resolve the conflict within me. Perhaps having a wife, a home, a family of my own would quiet the voice that kept insisting I was living inauthentically. Perhaps adult responsibilities would finally force me to let go of desires that seemed incompatible with the life I was building. The wedding was beautiful. Patricia looked radiant in a lace gown that had belonged to her grandmother. My sisters all attended, with Sarah serving as one of the bridesmaids. My parents beamed with pride. Friends and colleagues celebrated with us, toasting to our future, offering advice about marriage, congratulating us on finding each other. I smiled through the entire event, played my role perfectly, danced with my new wife, and thanked everyone for coming. But underneath the surface, I felt like I was attending my own funeral, burying the parts of myself that I could no longer afford to acknowledge. Married life was good in many ways. Patricia and I moved into a larger apartment, then eventually bought a small house in the suburbs. I advanced in my career, taking on more responsibilities and earning promotions. Patricia pursued her own professional ambitions, eventually becoming a project manager at her firm. We hosted dinner parties, took vacations, supported each other through various challenges, and built a life that looked perfect from the outside. But the secret part of me did not disappear just because I had taken wedding vows. If anything, it became more insistent, more difficult to ignore. The challenge now was finding any opportunity for private expression. Patricia and I shared a bedroom, a bathroom, a home where hiding anything was exponentially more difficult than it had been in my bachelor apartment. I no longer had a personal space that was off-limits to her. She did laundry, organized closets, and would have immediately noticed any items that did not belong to her or to me in my masculine identity. I had to get rid of everything I had carefully collected, disposing of it piece by piece in dumpsters far from our neighborhood, feeling a profound sense of loss with each discarded item. For the next 8 years, I lived in a state of complete suppression. I devoted myself to being the husband Patricia deserved, the employee my company valued, the son my parents could be proud of, the brother my sisters could rely on. I stopped thinking about dressing, stopped entertaining fantasies about feminine expression, stopped acknowledging that entire part of my identity. I became skilled at the art of denial, convincing myself that I had simply outgrown those desires, that they belonged to an immature version of myself that no longer existed. I focused on tangible achievements, on building a successful career, on being a good partner. And for a while, this strategy seemed to work. The ache diminished to a barely noticeable background hum, something I could almost forget about for days or even weeks at a time. But then Patricia got sick. It started with vague symptoms that we both dismissed as stress or perhaps a virus. Fatigue, occasional dizzy spells, a general sense of not feeling quite right. She went to the doctor, who ran tests that came back inconclusive. More tests followed, then referrals to specialists, then finally a diagnosis that shattered the life we had built. Ovarian cancer, already advanced by the time it was detected, with a prognosis that gave us months rather than years. The next period of our lives became consumed with treatments, with hospitals, with clinging to hope even as it became increasingly clear that hope was not enough. Patricia fought with incredible courage. She endured chemotherapy that made her violently ill, radiation that left her exhausted, surgeries that promised results they could not deliver. I took leave from work to care for her, spending my days managing medications, preparing meals she could barely eat, holding her hand through pain that no amount of morphine could fully control. My sisters rallied around us, taking turns visiting, bringing food, offering support in whatever ways they could. My parents prayed, and friends sent cards, and colleagues organized fundraisers. But none of it changed the fundamental reality that Patricia was dying, and all I could do was bear witness to her gradual departure from this world. During those final months, Patricia said something to me that I have replayed in my mind countless times since. We were sitting in our living room, with her wrapped in blankets despite the warmth of the afternoon, her body frail in ways that shocked me every time I looked at her. She took my hand, her grip weak but insistent, and told me that she knew I had been hiding something throughout our entire marriage. She did not know what it was, and at this point it did not matter. But she wanted me to promise her that after she was gone, I would stop hiding. She told me that life was too short, too precious, too fleeting to spend it being anyone other than who you truly are. She made me promise that I would find whatever it was I had been suppressing and give myself permission to embrace it. I promised, though I did not fully understand what I was promising, and she seemed satisfied. Patricia died on a Tuesday morning in October, with autumn sunlight streaming through the hospital window and her family gathered around her bed. I held her hand until the end, watching the monitors flatline, hearing the doctors confirm what we all already knew. The funeral was well attended, with people sharing stories about her kindness, her intelligence, her impact on their lives. I delivered a eulogy that captured her essence while revealing nothing of my own inner turmoil. After the service, after the burial, after the reception where people offered condolences and awkward attempts at comfort, I returned to our empty house and felt the full weight of loss settle over me like a physical presence. The months following Patricia's death were the darkest of my life. Grief consumed me in ways I had not anticipated. I went through the motions of existence, returning to work, maintaining basic routines, responding to the concerned messages from friends and family. But internally, I was hollow, gutted by loss and by the realization that I had spent 8 years with someone I loved but had never been fully honest with. The promise I had made to Patricia haunted me. What had she meant when she asked me to stop hiding? Had she somehow sensed the truth about my identity, or was she speaking more generally about emotional availability? I did not know, and I would never be able to ask her. A year passed, then another. I existed in a state of suspended animation, neither fully alive nor entirely dead, going through the rituals of life without engaging with them meaningfully. My work performance suffered, and I was passed over for a promotion I would have received under different circumstances. My relationships with friends deteriorated as I withdrew into isolation. Even my sisters struggled to reach me, their phone calls going unanswered, their invitations declined. I was stuck in a loop of grief and regret, unable to move forward, but equally unable to return to who I had been before Patricia's death. It was Sarah who finally broke through my isolation. She showed up at my house unannounced on a Saturday morning, armed with coffee and determination. She told me that she loved me, that everyone was worried about me, and that it was time to start living again. We talked for hours about Patricia, about loss, about the challenge of continuing when someone you love has left a void that cannot be filled. And then, with characteristic directness, Sarah asked me a question that changed everything. She asked if I remembered that afternoon in the attic when we were children, when I had tried on our grandmother's Victorian clothing. I was stunned that she had held on to that memory for decades, that she had never forgotten that moment of vulnerability and exploration. She told me that she had always known I was different, that I carried something inside me that did not fit the conventional boxes society tried to impose. She did not use the words cross-dressing or transgender. She simply acknowledged that there was a part of me I had been hiding for my entire life, and she wondered if now, with Patricia gone and no one to answer to but myself, I might finally be ready to explore that hidden territory. Her words unlocked something in me. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to remember those nights in my childhood bedroom, wearing my mother's vintage clothing, feeling a sense of rightness that eluded me in every other area of life. I remembered the peace I had felt during those brief periods in my bachelor apartment when I had purchased a few items and allowed myself small moments of authentic expression. I remembered Patricia's deathbed request that I stop hiding. And I realized that I had been given a second chance, an opportunity to discover who I truly was without the constraints of others' expectations. I started slowly, cautiously, as if approaching something fragile that might shatter if handled too roughly. I went online, researching information about cross-dressing, about gender identity, about the spectrum of human experience that exists beyond the rigid binary most of us are taught to accept. I discovered entire communities of people who shared similar experiences, who described feelings I had thought were mine alone. I read personal accounts, academic articles, psychological studies. I learned vocabulary that helped me articulate things I had felt but could never name. Terms like gender expression, gender fluidity, and authentic self became part of my understanding. I realized that what I had been experiencing was not a perversion or a sickness or even particularly unusual. It was simply a facet of human diversity, a variation in how identity manifests itself. Armed with this new understanding, I began to acquire items again. This time, I was more systematic, more intentional. I researched proper sizing, read guides about choosing appropriate styles, learned about makeup and wigs, and the various techniques people use to achieve the presentation they desire. I started with basics once again, but now I was doing so with a sense of purpose rather than shame. I purchased a few dresses in styles I found appealing, undergarments that fit properly, shoes that were surprisingly difficult to walk in but made me feel elegant nonetheless. I set up a space in my home, Patricia's former craft room, as my dressing area. I bought a full-length mirror, proper lighting, and storage solutions that would keep everything organized and private. The first time I dressed completely in this new phase of my life, I was 53 years old. I stood before that mirror, wearing a simple navy dress with a modest neckline, kitten heels that added just a few inches to my height, and minimal makeup that I had applied following online tutorials. I had chosen a wig, shoulder-length brown hair with subtle highlights, that approximated what my hair might have looked like if I had been assigned female at birth. And when I looked at my reflection, I saw Alexandra for the first time. Not Alex trying on women's clothing, but Alexandra, a complete identity that had been waiting decades to emerge. The feeling was indescribable. It was relief and recognition and homecoming all rolled into a single moment. I moved around the room, adjusting to the heels, feeling the dress move with my body, becoming familiar with this version of myself that felt more authentic than any masculine presentation I had ever achieved. I took photos, not to share but simply to document this moment, to prove to myself that it was real. And then I sat down in the comfortable chair by the window and cried. I cried for all the lost years, for the opportunities one had missed, for the relationships I had maintained while hiding such a fundamental part of myself. But I also cried with gratitude that I had finally found the courage to embrace this identity, that I was still alive to experience this transformation, that it was not too late to become who I had always been. From that point forward, Alexandra became a regular part of my life. I dressed at home several times a week, sometimes for entire weekends, learning to inhabit this identity more fully with each passing day. I practiced walking, gestures, vocal patterns. I watched videos, took online courses, and experimented with different styles and presentations. I discovered what kinds of clothes made me feel confident versus self-conscious, which makeup techniques worked with my facial structure, how to create a feminine silhouette despite my masculine build. It was like learning a new language, and I approached it with the dedication of someone who had waited a lifetime for this education. But there was a difference between dressing at home in private and presenting as Alexandra to the world. The thought of being seen in public terrified me. What if someone recognized me? What if I was mocked, harassed, or worse? I lived in a small community where I had established professional credibility, where people knew me as Alex the accountant, the widower, the quiet guy who kept to himself. The idea of shattering that image felt impossibly risky. So for months, Alexandra existed only within the walls of my home, a secret that brought me joy but also a deepening sense of frustration. I was tired of hiding. I was exhausted by the double life. And yet, the fear of exposure kept me trapped. It was during this period of internal conflict that I met Jennifer. She was a new accountant at my firm, hired to handle an overflow of clients we had acquired after a competitor went out of business. Jennifer was in her late 40s, divorced with 2 adult children, and possessed an easygoing confidence that I envied. We were assigned to work together on a complicated audit, spending long hours reviewing financial documents and discussing discrepancies. Over the course of several weeks, we became friends. She was easy to talk to, quick to laugh, and remarkably perceptive about reading people's emotional states. One day, after we had finished a particularly tedious meeting, she invited me to grab dinner at a small restaurant near the office. I agreed, grateful for the company and the distraction from my solitary existence. During that dinner, the conversation shifted from work topics to personal lives. Jennifer talked about her divorce, about the challenge of rediscovering herself after spending 2 decades focused on being a wife and mother. She spoke about the liberation of living alone, of making decisions based solely on her own desires, of pursuing interests she had set aside for years. Her honesty prompted my own. I found myself telling her about Patricia, about the grief that still lingered, about the sense of being stuck between a past I could not return to and a future I could not quite envision. And then, perhaps prompted by the wine we had consumed or simply by Jennifer's genuine interest, I told her something I had never told anyone except Sarah. I told her about Alexandra. The words came out haltingly at first, then in a rush, as if a dam had broken, and everything I had been holding back for decades was suddenly flooding forth. I explained about the childhood memories, the teenage experimentation, the suppression during my marriage, and the recent rediscovery of this aspect of my identity. I talked about the fear and the shame and the incredible sense of rightness I felt when I dressed as Alexandra. I expected shock, disgust, or at the very least uncomfortable silence. Instead, Jennifer reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She told me that what I had just shared required tremendous courage, and she was honored that I trusted her with this information. She asked questions, not invasive ones, but genuine inquiries aimed at understanding my experience. She wanted to know what name I used, what I enjoyed about presenting as feminine, whether I had considered transitioning permanently, or if this was more about expression than identity. I answered as honestly as I could, explaining that I was still figuring out the details, but that Alexandra felt like an essential part of who I was, not a costume I put on, but a truth I finally had permission to acknowledge. Jennifer became my confidant, and eventually much more than that. She wanted to meet Alexandra, to see this side of me that I had revealed only verbally. I was terrified by the prospect, but I also recognized this as an opportunity to be seen and accepted in a way I had never experienced before. We planned an evening at my house, with me promising to present as Alexandra for what would be the first time anyone other than my reflection had witnessed this identity. I spent the entire day preparing, changing outfits multiple times, redoing my makeup, questioning every decision. When Jennifer arrived, I answered the door as Alexandra, wearing a teal dress that fell to just below my knees, nude stockings, modest heels, and jewelry that Patricia had left behind. I had styled the wig carefully, applied makeup with a slightly heavier hand than usual, and even used perfume to complete the presentation. Jennifer's face lit up with a genuine smile. She told me I looked beautiful, but more importantly, she told me I looked happy in a way she had never seen during our months of working together. We spent that evening talking, laughing, and simply existing together with complete honesty. Jennifer helped me refine my makeup technique, offered suggestions about clothing styles that would be flattering, and shared stories about her own journey towards self-acceptance after her divorce. It was the first time I had experienced complete transparency with another person since that conversation with Sarah months earlier, and the relief was immense. I was not alone. I had an ally who saw all of me and chose to remain present rather than flee. Our relationship evolved naturally from friendship into romance. Jennifer appreciated both sides of me, Alex and Alexandra, understanding that they were not separate entities, but different expressions of the same person. She encouraged me to explore my identity more fully, to consider venturing out in public, to stop limiting Alexandra to the private confines of my home. With her support, I began to take small steps toward visibility. We went for drives in the evening with me dressed as Alexandra, traveling to neighboring towns where the risk of recognition was minimal. We visited stores where I could browse women's sections without feeling like I was trespassing. We even attended a support group for people exploring gender identity, where I met others who shared similar experiences and who offered advice, encouragement, and community. The prospect of being Alexandra in my own town, among people who knew me, remained daunting. But Jennifer had an idea that would serve as a test, a way to gauge my comfort level and the reactions of others without fully exposing my everyday identity. Our city had a summer concert series in the park, evening events where hundreds of people gathered to listen to music and socialize. Jennifer suggested we attend one of these concerts with me presenting as Alexandra. The crowd would be large enough that anonymity was likely, the lighting would be dim as the sun set, and if the experience was overwhelming, we could leave early. It felt like a manageable risk, and I agreed. The preparation for that outing was more intensive than anything I had done before. I wanted to pass, to blend in, to avoid drawing attention or generating negative reactions. Jennifer helped me choose an outfit that was stylish but not flashy, age-appropriate, and seasonally correct. I wore black slacks, a floral blouse, a lightweight cardigan, and ballet flats that were comfortable enough for walking but still feminine. My makeup was carefully applied to look natural rather than theatrical. The wig was styled simply, pulled back from my face with a clip. I looked in the mirror and saw someone who could believably be a woman in her mid-50s attending a community event. Jennifer pronounced me ready, and we drove to the park just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. Walking from the parking area to the concert lawn, I felt exposed in a way that no amount of private dressing had prepared me for. Every person we passed felt like a potential threat, someone who might recognize me, question me, or react with hostility. But something remarkable happened. No one paid any particular attention to us. We were simply two women walking together, unremarkable in our ordinariness. We found a spot on the grass, spread out the blanket Jennifer had brought, and settled in to enjoy the music. Over the next 2 hours, I gradually relaxed. People around us chatted, laughed, and focused on the performance rather than scrutinizing their neighbors. A few individuals smiled at us in that friendly way strangers do in community settings. One woman complimented my blouse. Another asked if we were enjoying the music. Each interaction that treated me as simply another person rather than as something unusual or threatening reinforced that I could exist as Alexandra in the world and be accepted. That evening transformed my understanding of what was possible. I had spent decades convinced that presenting as feminine in public would result in ridicule or danger. Instead, I discovered that most people were too absorbed in their own lives to closely examine mine, and those who did notice simply saw a person trying to enjoy a summer evening. The fear did not completely disappear, but it loosened its grip significantly. I began to venture out more regularly, building confidence with each outing. Jennifer and I went to restaurants, shopping centers, movie theaters, and art galleries, with me presenting as Alexandra about half the time. I started to develop a wardrobe that reflected my actual tastes rather than what I imagined I should wear. I experimented with different styles, discovering that I favored classic, somewhat vintage-inspired looks over contemporary trends. I found a balance between Alex and Alexandra, understanding that both were authentic expressions and that I did not need to choose one at the expense of the other. My relationship with Jennifer deepened. We talked about making our arrangement more permanent, about moving in together, about building a future that honored all aspects of my identity. She was unlike anyone I had ever known, completely comfortable with complexity, refusing to demand that I fit into predetermined categories. When I dressed as Alex, she related to me as a man. When I presented as Alexandra, she interacted with me as a woman. And somehow, this fluidity felt natural rather than confusing. She introduced me to her adult children as her partner, explaining the situation with matter-of-fact honesty. To my amazement, they accepted the information without drama, curious but not judgmental, more interested in whether I made their mother happy than in the specifics of my gender presentation. The question of telling my own family remained unresolved. My parents were elderly, set in their ways, products of an era that did not recognize or accept the kind of complexity I embodied. I worried that revealing Alexandra to them would cause confusion or disappointment, that it might damage our relationship in ways that could not be repaired. My sisters were more open-minded, but I still hesitated. Sarah already knew something, but she did not know the full extent of my recent exploration. Margaret, Elizabeth, and Catherine had no inkling that their brother harbored this secret. The prospect of coming out to them, of showing them Alexandra, filled me with anxiety despite the acceptance I had found elsewhere. Jennifer encouraged me to trust my siblings, reminding me that they had known me my entire life and that their love was likely more resilient than I feared. We decided to start with Sarah, given our history and her previous hints of understanding. I called her, asked if she would be willing to visit for a weekend, and explained that there was something important I wanted to share. Sarah agreed without hesitation, and 2 weeks later, she arrived at my house with an overnight bag and her characteristic direct gaze that saw through pretense. I had planned an elaborate reveal, thinking I needed to build up to the moment gradually. But Sarah had other ideas. Within an hour of her arrival, she asked point-blank if I was going to show her Alexandra, or if we were going to dance around the subject all weekend. Her bluntness was both terrifying and liberating. I asked her to give me 30 minutes, then went upstairs to change. When I came back down, dressed in a simple gray dress with a cowl neck, wearing the shoulder-length brown wig and modest makeup, Sarah stood up from the couch and walked directly toward me. I braced myself for any reaction, but what I got was a fierce hug and words that I will cherish for the rest of my life. She told me that she had been waiting decades for me to trust her with this, that she had always known there was more to me than the masculine presentation I showed the world, and that seeing me finally comfortable in my own skin was one of the greatest gifts she had ever received. We spent that entire weekend as sisters. Sarah insisted on using feminine pronouns when I was dressed as Alexandra, treating me with the same casual familiarity she showed my other sisters. We went shopping together, with Sarah offering honest opinions about what suited me and what did not. We cooked meals side by side, watched old movies, and talked about everything from childhood memories to present circumstances. She shared stories about her own journey towards self-acceptance, about the challenges of being a woman in a male-dominated profession, about finding her voice and learning to advocate for herself. Our conversations had a depth and honesty they had never possessed before, unencumbered by the secrets I had been keeping. When the weekend ended, Sarah made me promise to introduce Alexandra to our other sisters, assuring me that they would be equally supportive even if their initial reactions might include surprise or confusion. Emboldened by Sarah's acceptance, I arranged a family gathering at my home. I invited Margaret, Elizabeth, and Catherine, along with their spouses and Sarah, explaining only that I had something important to discuss and that Jennifer would also be present. They arrived on a sunny afternoon in late spring, curious but unsuspecting. We had lunch together, with me presenting as Alex, catching up on family news and life updates. Then, after the meal, I asked everyone to remain seated in the living room because I needed to share something significant. The nervousness I felt rivaled anything I had experienced before, but Jennifer squeezed my hand encouragingly and Sarah gave me a knowing nod. I excused myself, went upstairs, and transformed into Alexandra. When I returned to the living room, the silence was profound. My sisters stared, their expressions ranging from confusion to dawning understanding. It was Margaret who spoke first, asking in a tentative voice if I was wearing women's clothing. I confirmed that I was, then launched into an explanation I had rehearsed, but that still came out somewhat jumbled. I told them about the childhood memories they might have forgotten or dismissed, about the decades of hiding, about Patricia's deathbed request, about discovering Alexandra and the peace she brought me. I explained that I was not transitioning in the conventional sense, that I identified as someone who existed across gender boundaries rather than firmly within one category, and that both Alex and Alexandra were authentic expressions of who I was. I told them that I loved them, that I understood this might be difficult to process, and that I hoped they could find a way to accept this aspect of my identity even if they did not fully understand it. The reactions varied. Elizabeth started crying, though she quickly clarified that these were tears of relief because she had sensed for years that I was unhappy and had worried about my emotional state. Catherine asked a dozen questions, her analytical mind trying to categorize and understand this new information. Margaret seemed shell-shocked, sitting in silence while her husband rubbed her back supportively. Sarah moved to sit beside me, a physical show of solidarity that spoke louder than words. Over the next several hours, we talked. I answered questions, shared experiences, and showed them photographs of Alexandra at various stages of development. Jennifer contributed her perspective, explaining how she had come to know both sides of me and why she believed this integration was essential for my well-being. By the end of the evening, something had shifted. My sisters might not have fully understood the complexities of gender identity or the nuances of my experience, but they accepted that this was real for me and that hiding it had caused profound pain. Margaret hugged me before she left, whispering that she would need time to adjust, but that her love for me had not changed. Elizabeth asked if she could take photos with Alexandra to include in the family album, treating this as simply another aspect of who I was rather than something shameful to conceal. Catherine gave me a book she thought I might find helpful, a memoir written by someone who had navigated a similar journey. And Sarah stayed behind after everyone else had left, helping me remove my makeup and telling me how proud she was of my courage. The months that followed brought continued growth and integration. I became more comfortable existing as Alexandra in public spaces, less concerned about passing perfectly, and more focused on simply being authentic. Jennifer and I decided to get married, a small ceremony with only close family and friends, where I walked down the aisle as Alexandra, wearing a lavender dress that made me feel beautiful. My sisters attended, fully supportive, and even my elderly parents came, though they never quite grasped the full significance of what they were witnessing. To them, I was their son in somewhat unusual clothing, and they chose to interpret it as an eccentric fashion choice rather than engage with the deeper implications. I accepted their limited understanding, grateful that they showed up at all. My professional life required more careful navigation. I continued to present as Alex at work, not ready to risk my career by introducing complexity into an environment that valued conformity. But I became more active in LGBTQ advocacy outside of work, volunteering with organizations that supported people exploring gender identity, speaking at events about my experience, and connecting with communities that had once seemed impossibly distant. I discovered that my story resonated with many people, particularly those in my age group who had spent decades hiding essential parts of themselves and were only now finding the courage to emerge. Living as both Alex and Alexandra has taught me profound lessons about identity, authenticity, and the courage required to be fully human. I have learned that gender is far more fluid and complex than the rigid categories most of us are taught to accept. I have discovered that it is never too late to embrace who you truly are, that no amount of time spent hiding makes the truth disappear, and that the fear of rejection is often more powerful than rejection itself. I have found that the people who truly love you will find ways to accept all of you, even the parts they do not initially understand, and that building authentic relationships requires the vulnerability of complete honesty. There are still challenges. I navigate a world that prefers simplicity over complexity, that wants people to fit neatly into boxes labeled male or female, masculine or feminine. I encounter strangers who stare, who whisper, who react with confusion or hostility when they cannot easily categorize me. I deal with bureaucratic systems that have no framework for someone like me, forms that demand I choose M or F when neither captures my reality. But these challenges feel manageable because I am no longer fighting against myself. The internal conflict that consumed so much energy for so many years has been replaced by a sense of integration, of wholeness, of finally being at home in my own skin regardless of how I choose to present it. Jennifer and I have built a life together that honors complexity. We travel, pursue shared interests, support each other through the inevitable difficulties that come with being human. She encourages my continued exploration of gender expression, celebrates both Alex and Alexandra, and loves me without demanding that I simplify myself for her convenience. My sisters have become allies and friends in new ways, our relationships deepened by honesty and vulnerability. Sarah and I are closer than we have ever been, bound not just by shared blood, but by shared understanding of what it means to claim your authentic self in a world that often demands conformity. I think often about Patricia and the promise she extracted from me as she lay dying. I believe she knew, at some level, that I was hiding something fundamental about my identity. Whether she specifically understood that I had been suppressing my desire to express femininity, or whether she simply sensed a more general inauthenticity, I will never know. But I have kept my promise to her. I have stopped hiding. I have embraced the fullness of who I am, messy and complicated and resistant to easy categorization. And in doing so, I have discovered a quality of life I did not know was possible, a sense of peace that comes from alignment between internal truth and external presentation. To anyone who is reading this and recognizing themselves in my story, I want you to know that it is never too late. You are not alone in feeling like you do not quite fit the role society has assigned you. The fear you feel about revealing your authentic self is real, but so is the liberation that comes from doing so. You do not have to transition completely, commit to one presentation, or follow any predetermined path. Your journey belongs to you, and there is no single correct way to navigate it. What matters is that you give yourself permission to explore, to question, to try on different ways of being until you find what feels right. What matters is that you stop sacrificing your authentic self for the comfort of others. What matters is that you recognize your inherent worth regardless of how you choose to present your gender. The transformation that started from within has changed everything about how I move through the world. I am no longer pretending, no longer performing, no longer hiding. I am simply being. Alexandra is not a costume I wear or a role I play. She is an expression of something essential, a facet of my identity that had been buried for decades but never truly disappeared. Learning to embrace her, to integrate her with the masculine aspects of myself, to present her to the world despite fear and uncertainty, has been the most challenging and most rewarding journey of my life. I am 60 years old now, with more years behind me than ahead. I will never get back the decades I spent hiding, the opportunities one missed, the relationships I maintained while keeping essential parts of myself concealed. But I refuse to spend whatever time remains denying my truth or living according to others' expectations. I choose authenticity, even when it is uncomfortable. I choose honesty, even when it is risky. I choose to be fully myself, in all my complicated, multifaceted humanity, regardless of whether that makes sense to anyone else. This is my life, hard-won and precious. And I intend to live every remaining moment of it as truthfully as I possibly can.